All right. In the absence of a gavel, I called this meeting of the Madison Historic Preservation Commission to order, it being 7:30 and time for our meeting to begin. May I have the Open Public Meeting Act?
Certainly. Hello, everyone. In compliance with the Open Public Meetings Act, adequate notice of this meeting of the Historic Preservation Commission was provided by transmitting a copy of the meeting notice to the Madison Eagle and the Morris County Daily Record, posting a copy on the bulletin board at the main entrance of Borough Hall, and filing a copy in the Borough Office Clerk, all on Tuesday, June 4th. Copies of the notice were made available to members of the general public.
Thank you. Laurie? Roll call.
Yes, I will take a verbal roll call. Co-chairperson Mary Ellen Lenahan.
Here.
Co-chairperson Janet Foster.
Here.
Attorney Jonathan Testa.
Present.
John Forte, commission member. He's absent. Commission member David Luber.
Here. Attend.
Commission member John Solu.
Here.
Commission member Carmine Toto.
Here.
Commission member Chris Kellogg.
Here.
Commission member Karen Geisey. She's absent. And commission member Jill Rhodes, also absent.
Correct.
Last week, it was brought to my attention by the attorney for the Historic Preservation Commission that a request had been made for my recusal. I want to make it clear that I have not spoken to any other member of the commission regarding my position on the application. So I'm voluntarily recusing myself for the deliberations and the voting. To be clear, I was not aware of the allegations that underlie the request for my recusal until I spoke with counsel for the Historic Preservation Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. The Commission has some business, in-house business. We have approval of minutes. We have rather a lot of minutes stacked up, and they have been sent to all the Commission members for review and review again. Let's do them in order and begin with minutes from the special meeting of May 6th, 2019, 14 Lincoln Place, a continuation of the hearing, sorry. Minutes from May the 6th. Have all the members had a chance to review them? And are there any comments or corrections that need to be made at this time? All right, may I have a motion to approve the minutes of May the 6th, 2019?
I'd like to make a motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you. Is a second? Second from Ms. Lenahan. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, the minutes will pass for May the 6th. Then we have minutes from our regular Historic Preservation Commission meeting of May the 14th, which was not about the theater application, but some other business that we had. Those minutes were also sent to you. Are there any comments or questions about the minutes of the regular meeting of May 14th? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve the minutes from the May 14th meeting, regular meeting of the HPC?
So moved.
Thank you, Dave. A second?
Second.
Mary Ellen, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, we will approve the regular meeting minutes of May the 14th. May the 14th, we also had an executive session meeting. That meeting minutes, rather short discussion, were also sent to members. Are there any questions or comments about the executive session meeting from May the 14th? Hearing none, do I have...
Chairman Foster, let's just make sure we're clear on this. They are executive session meeting minutes. This is not to have them open to public inspection at this point in time. It's just for the approval of those minutes, however.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification, yes. So is there a motion to accept the minutes from the executive session on May 14th.
Motion.
Okay, a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? No. Hearing none, we will accept the executive session meeting minutes from May the 14th, 2019. And finally, we have minutes from the special meeting, continuation of the theater application from May 28th, 2 weeks ago. Those minutes were also forwarded to everyone. Do you have any questions or comments about those minutes?
No.
No? All right. Is there a motion to accept the minutes of May 28th?
So moved.
Thank you.
Second.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, we will accept the minutes from May 28th, 2019. And they will be appropriately become part of our record. Thank you. All right. The Preservation Commission would appreciate going into executive session according to a resolution that was put into the agenda for the meeting. I would like to make the motion to have the HPC in executive session. Is there a second for that?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? No. All right, then we will go to executive session. We will be back as soon as we
Action will be taken.
May I please, this is Michelle Donato. I'm here on behalf of Save Madison Theater, Inc. I was rather surprised to learn that Mr. Kellogg was recusing himself and that there had been some challenge to his participation. I was not previously told of that, and I'm also curious as to why several other members that were here, you have a very, very light board here, are not here this evening. And then secondly, with regard to executive session, this is a closed session under the Open Public Meetings Act that will be
Yes, we're going to be going next door, Ms. Donato. And
Right.
I'm sorry? Attorney-client privilege.
I'll address that separately then.
Sure. Ms. Donato, if you would like to find out the allegations in favor of the recusal, I would ask you to please direct your attention to the applicant's attorney. You guys can discuss that outside the presence of the public on a sidebar while we're in closed session.
I will do so. You're going under an executive session pursuant to the Open Public Meetings Act?
That's correct.
So I believe that your procedurally doing so is not consistent with the requirements of the Open
It
Public
is.
Meetings Act.
Did you read the agenda for today? There's a resolution, actually, that explains the
Resolution
basis
has
for
to be read into the
attorney-client
record. It has to
privilege.
state
Would you like me to read it?
attorney-client privilege.
Sure, I can read that into the record for you right now so we can move along. The resolution proposed to be recessed into closed session, whereas Section 8 of the Open Public Meetings Act, Chapter 231, Public Law of 1975, permits the exclusion of the public from a meeting in certain circumstances, and whereas the public body is of the opinion that such circumstances presently exist. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the Historic Preservation Commission of the Borough of Madison in the County of Morris in the State of New Jersey as follows. The public shall be excluded from discussions of and action upon the hereinafter specified subject matters. The general nature of the subject matter to be discussed is as follows: attorney-client privilege communications. It is anticipated at this time that the above subject matter will be made public at the conclusion of the specified subject matter. This resolution shall take effect immediately. No action will be taken in closed session.
And may I ask if the attorney-client privilege is related to the subject matter that I'm appearing before the commission on, i.e. the Madison Theater?
It's attorney-client privilege communications.
Regarding the theater?
It's regarding the procedures for today and how we're going to be handling that. Yes, ma'am.
So may I ask, Mr. Testa, what's
Deliberations will be
about
public.
procedures?
I'm sorry?
What is attorney-client privilege regarding procedures?
We're not going to be
Procedures are a
going
highly
into that
public
discussion
issue.
right now. If you want to speak about, if you want to ask questions, it's not going to be answered right now. All right? We're recessing the public session under 7B of the Open Public Meetings Act.
Okay, well, I
That's
do
all-
not
that's all
understand
it
how
means.
public procedure would be privileged, but my objection is noted. Thank you.
Thank you for the record. Appreciate it.
Okay. Members, could we go next door for a few minutes? Thank you. All right, I'd like to make a motion first to close the executive session of the meeting and reconvene the regular meeting. Thank you for your patience. Members of the HPC, all in favor of closing executive session, reconvening regular meeting, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? No. Okay, then we are reconvened in the regular meeting, and our order of business is to resume our discussion of the Madison Theater proposal.
There was submittals of summations by the counsel for the objector and the applicant. I have copies of them here. At this point in time, I invite the applicant and the objector to read those statements in to the record if they'd like. I have a copy if you want to say that. Okay, I can get you.
You can rest. Okay, any reason to... No?
Excuse me, I'm still getting it.
I have a copy.
I have it. I didn't expect that we were going to be reading a lengthy summation into the record. So I'll pull it out and I will...
You don't have to if you don't want to, but if you recall from your summation, you had requested that you have the opportunity to provide that summation to the public.
Ms. Donato, you can do a summary if you'd like, rather than read the entire statement. Okay.
He's...
Wait, I have to hold this mic. They took the mic away. There was another mic here. It was...
Is it over there? Is that you want to...
never mind, I'll just hold this one. Okay, now, good evening, and thank you very much again for having this hearing. I must comment that it seems very unusual to see such a small number of members of the commission here, and I'm very concerned regarding the fact that one member this evening announced that his participation was challenged, and as requested by Mr. Testa, I did speak briefly to Mr. Wilson, the attorney for the applicant, regarding that, and he indicated to me that he had challenged the participation of Mr. Kellogg based on bias, a record of bias, and based on the fact that his wife signed a petition. I am very perturbed by the fact that Mr. Kellogg, who was I looked at all of the videos, and I attended one hearing. He asked intelligent questions. He raised issues that are directly relevant to the design criteria contained in the ordinance. There were people who asked questions and said things that seemed to be very favorably inclined to the applicant. So if Mr. Kellogg is being disqualified for bias, I really think that you have to look at some comments from others. And I think it's really inappropriate for somebody to disqualify members and not let the other attorney know what is going on. So that's problematic.
To be clear, the allegations are biased. That's an allegation that was made.
I understand.
There was an allegation of bias.
I understand
As
that.
abundance of caution, as per Mr. Kellogg's statement, he decided to voluntarily recuse himself from the deliberations and voting on the matter.
Well, Mr. Testa, there's no way for me to know any of that without asking. And I have no idea what anyone said to Mr. Kellogg. I don't know whether or not it was suggested that he leave, that it was for anything. And the other issue had to do with the fact that his wife signed a petition. And the petition itself is one which simply urged this municipality to take action to preserve the theater. It didn't say deny demolition, it said preserve it. And I think that if we start, this is a personal interest issue that would not apply. The case law in New Jersey really distinguishes a personal interest where a spouse has indicated a position on something. And so I really have a very serious problem with the idea that one member, who obviously is a very knowledgeable man and had a lot of excellent questions, is not participating. It's like cleansing the board. I don't think it's appropriate to do that. I don't know how it came about. I don't know what kind of threats were there, if there were any. I don't know the circumstances. So part of the problem is that a very, I think Mr. Kellogg's an architect or something. I don't know for sure, but in listening to his questions, he just seemed to ask very important questions that directly related to the ordinance. So I'm rather disappointed that he's not participating, because someone might have perceived that he would be voting consistently with the ordinance and vote to require certain actions be taken. So I have a problem with that. I noticed that there was also Ms. Rhodes, who I believe isn't here this evening, but because she signed a petition before she was even a member of this commission, I think, I'm not sure for sure, but apparently her participation was challenged. So these, it's one thing if somebody is going to make money off of it or their spouse is going to make money, but when we start trying to disqualify people because of questions and statements, why don't you just put a muzzle on your commission members so they don't ask any questions that might be in favor of or against the application? And if you're going to disqualify...
Number one, you have the facts incorrect as to Ms. Rhodes. Although there was an allegation of a request for recusal, she wasn't going to be here regardless.
I'm sorry, she wasn't what, Mr. Testa?
She was not going to be here regardless. So I appreciate you trying to create a record that's not factually accurate. However, for the purposes of now, if your objections you've preserved on the record, can we move on?
Well, again, Mr. Testa, how would I know factually whether your statement is accurate or my statement is accurate?
At the last meeting.
I did not hear her saying that, but I will stand corrected, certainly. So, and then there was a third person who I believe was at one of these last meetings, a Miss Jeffries, and I don't see her here either. Karen Jesse, Jeise. Did she just not attend this evening?
Correct.
She just did not attend. Because I know
She put in a letter of resignation yesterday. And she's waiting for that. She's waiting for that to be.
Excuse me. You know what? We are going to finish this application tonight. We're going to vote. I am not a fan of midnight hours, so please, let's try to be respectful and not make this a performance.
She's still waiting for the approval and acceptance of that from the mayor at this point.
Okay, so I don't know. I know that there was some issue about a statement that she made during one of the proceedings having been reported incorrectly in the press. So I don't know whether, do you know whether or not she was asked to disqualify herself? Do you know if there's any discussions?
We're not going to get into the conversations between my conversations with the commission member. That's just totally improper. And for you to actually try to elicit a response at this point in time is also equally improper.
I don't think it is, Mr. Testa. I think that it's important to know whether or not people who may have been perceived as making some statements that were not liked by the applicant were then asked to disqualify themselves. So that's all I'm saying.
We have a quorum. We have experienced members here to hear the case. We would like to hear any comments that you have before we get to our statements and voting. Thank you.
Okay, and I appreciate the opportunity to make oral comments because I think that a written submission is certainly lacks some of the interchange that is very beneficial and healthy in any decision-making process by a local commission. I would be the last person in the world to ask this commission to act in any manner that is contrary to the municipal land use law or contrary to your ordinance. And there are certain aspects of what has occurred here that give me great pause and question, first as to the procedural accuracy of what's taking place, and secondly as to the adherence to the requirements of the ordinance. And in addition, it appears that the burden of proof has somehow been shifted to a nonprofit organization that is simply trying to save a historic theater that has great potential for this for its historic district. So, in the big picture, that's why individual citizens have gathered together and have essentially joined forces to try to convince this commission that there are prudent actions that you could take consistent with the ordinance that governs you. From a procedural perspective, I'm a little confused as to what is actually before you with respect to the application for development. Initially, as I pointed out in my summation, in discussions that I had with Mr. Testa and Mr. Wilson, the attorney for the applicant, I was led to believe that there were three things before the commission. One being this commission's advisory review of the application for development, which would include the height variance, the number of stories. There's a whole array of variances. You have impervious coverage, you have setbacks, there's a whole array of variances. It's the advisory function of the commission that is supposed to be undertaken when the application has been deemed complete or when it has been scheduled for hearing. And it is my understanding that neither of those two events has taken place. It's not complete because there's no environmental impact statement and potentially other things, and there is no public hearing yet. So it may be that is the reason why there is not at this time pending before this commission a request for review of the application for development. However, I think that in listening to the video of the meeting when Mr. Laughlin was providing counsel to the commission, I noted that he seemed to say that you didn't have the purview to review the variances. And you do have that purview, and I think Mr. Testa may have repeated that, so I'm just confused. You have the right to do it. You have a right to send a delegate to the planning board and comment, but that is a separate and distinct function, and I did not see comment in that respect from the attorney for the applicant. And I think that, on the other hand, while there is this declining to address the development application, you're presented with a study that was never formally adopted, never incorporated into an ordinance or into the master plan, that apparently makes some recommendations from a non-binding group as to what type of development you should have in the downtown. So why even present that to you if you're not commenting on the variances and the site plan? So it poses a number of irregularities that I would find so inappropriate for a community of this historic stature in a building of this historic character and in a community with this historic ability and its ability to really create a difference. Do you want to be like every other town that knocks down its built environment, or do you want to be the borough of Madison? So having... Now, I'd like to pass to the two issues that both the attorney for the applicant and I have also commented on, and that relates to the certificates of historic review that are before you. And the Certificate of Historic Review for demolition is a very, very serious matter. And you have design guidelines and criteria that very specifically address what should be considered by you in that regard. And I think the first and most important of them, and one stressed not only by John Hatch, your own architect, but by Nancy Zerbe, who used to be the director of the State Historic Preservation Office for many years. The first thing you want to do is, can we save this building? And your ordinance mandates as its first criteria that every reasonable effort shall be made to use the building for its current use. You didn't hear anything in this record about any reasonable effort being made. You heard a presumption that nobody would want to have this building, to use this building. And I think that to avoid that issue and not decide on that head-on and without proofs to support your decision is a derogation of duty under the ordinance that you are created to implement. You're not there to ignore it. You're there to look at what it is and honor it, because the governing body in this community rendered a very important decision in adopting this ordinance. And it said that although you can't deny demolition, you can impose mandatory conditions. The first mandatory condition that we ask is that you require this applicant to make reasonable efforts to use this building for a theater. If someone can point to proof on this record that they did that, what they did is they said, we think it cost a lot of money to fix it, and we don't think anyone would be interested, and they put an ad online to use it for an office. That's what came out of the proof. Don't question and undermine the ability of this nonprofit group, Save Madison Theater, Inc., to come to the table and make a reasonable offer and make this problem go away. The developer wants to make money. He could sell the property. He can make money. He doesn't have to lose his property rights. But he does have the obligation to make reasonable, and it's not just a reasonable effort, every reasonable effort. And to just ignore that, I think, is the most serious error that could be made, and we implore you.
Please, let's keep the clapping to the minimum. This is not a performance. Do you have any other comments, Michelle?
Yes, I do. Yes. Thank you, Ms. Foster. I do. I don't have a lot more. Those, I do. There are also some very important other provisions recognizing that it is not just whether this is a key building or whether this is some outstanding example of architecture. In historic preservation, cultural association and similar historic characteristics, as noted by Nancy Zerbe, are as important. And this theater obviously has struck a chord in this community. I don't know how many meetings you've had where you fill the room with interested citizens. And I can't, I think perhaps one of the most impressive statements that Mr. Kellogg made, which probably led to his disqualification, was simply, did you as an applicant inquire into any of these efforts that have been made in past several years to save theaters in community, historic theaters? And it's an increasingly, we thought that Netflix ruined the theater. No, Netflix isn't. It's all coming back, and there's a very strong community component and an opportunity here that will create life in your community, that will revive how this theater was as part of your cultural fabric. And I think to ignore that, again, would be very unfortunate. And if we were if you were to say, well, it's not a key building, so let's just not worry about it, you're going to basically, I think the numbers are pretty, you're going to lose like more than half of your historic district because you don't have that many key buildings. You save both key and contributing, and I think that Ms. Zerbe's testimony in that regard was very, very thorough. Now, another issue that seemed to have dominated the dialogue for many, many months was this question of the condition of the building. So we had a structural engineer. Structure is structure, as he said. And the condition of the building is not nearly as bad as was painted. And in fact, in some of the applicant's own earlier reports, there's an acknowledgement that the building can be rehabilitated. Unfortunately, the applicant conflated what would be required to use this building as a theater with what would be required to use this building for 24 rental units and all that retail space. Those are two separate and distinct issues. And the only way you can get to the conflation is when you ignore the first criteria that you have of making every reasonable effort to preserve. Let's see. So I think that more attention to structural issues and abiding by some of the testimony that Mr. Colleen provided, a structural engineer with a very, very reputable history in this particular field, is something that should not be lightly ignored. It really, you're the only one that has the obligation in this community to save buildings. You're the only one that has the obligation to prevent demolition. You have the sole jurisdiction in that regard. You have the right to impose mandatory conditions. We beg you to do that. Now, I say all of this from the perspective that I guess principle number one of land use law is that the applicant has the burden of proof, not the public. So I participated at the last meeting, and I was really rather taken aback that there were more questions of the financial wherewithal of Save Madison Theater than there were with what efforts the applicant made to find someone who might be interested in using this as a theater. So I think it kind of switched the burden, and I think it's very, very unfortunate if it did so. So give us a chance. All we ask is a chance. If we can't step to the plate, if we can't offer money, if we cannot do it, then they can demolish it, and then we ask in that case that you very seriously and carefully implement the recommendations of your own expert, Mr. Hatch, in terms of don't create an empty space. Can you imagine the building being demolished and nothing being put in its place? For whatever reasons might have affected the applicant. Now it's like pulling somebody's front tooth. That's what it would be like in your community. So the whole demolition is the most serious thing you can do. You have the authority. You have the exclusive authority. We ask you to do something reasonable in accordance with your ordinance, and that will give an opportunity to do something that you will look back years from now and say, thank God we didn't let them demolish that theater. You'll look back with pride. And what I wanted to do is to say to you, the number I couldn't pick up before, okay, is if only key structures are saved, based on your National Register District nomination, 19 of the 49 buildings would be saved. You just don't save key structures. If we had all key structures, I don't know if there's even a place that does. So you want to just save the contributing. This is a very important contributing structure for many reasons, and I think the social fabric and the cultural context is the most important. Now, you're also being asked to review new construction. And with respect to the new construction, the first glaring problem is you do not have accurate renderings showing you the size of this building vis-a-vis the other buildings in this district. We know for sure that they measured the very top of the roof, which is it's not a straight roof. It's I don't know what you call that step-down roof like that on the facade. They measured that and compared that to the other buildings. But they didn't have scale drawings. Now, look, whether or not a rendering is scaled or not, it should be accurate. We sat here and watched this fancy little PowerPoint where the building shrunk, but it didn't really shrink enough. It needs to be accurate. You need to know, how is this going to impact the buildings? And I think, you know, if you do that and you get a really good 3D scale model, you're going to see what I think you would be better to see that now than to see it after it's built. Because everybody's going to come to you and say, look what they did. They were the historic preservation people, and they did that. So what do you have to do? All you have to do is say, give us information that is accurate, that helps us to see the size of this building. And when you think of the size, they never even showed you that big bulkhead on the top floor, which is going to be occupied by people in good weather. They said it's going to be like a recreation space. But then you have this big bulkhead. It runs the whole width of the building. It brings the building up to, I think it's either 56 or 59 feet. And it's really, you know, you need correct information. You shouldn't have to, it's 59 feet. And that's on your the drawing of their submission. Okay? It's 23 feet above the front wall of the front of the theater. That's what you would be commenting on in terms of visual compatibility. So I think the other thing that was so impressive to me was walking through the tunnel from the train station to Lincoln Place. Someone in designing that theater did a phenomenal job of just setting the facade right into the opening. There's not going to be a iota of light anymore. You're just going to see building. And who knows where else you're going to see it from. You probably see it from here and from other areas. So I don't know if you had projects of this type before. I can't really say. But this one can be a lasting scar. And you have the opportunity to do it the right way and make them present what they should have presented accurately in the first instance. This isn't a game. This isn't a game. This is a question of preserving the identity of a community and preserving its cultural core. So we ask that you impose as a mandatory condition pursuant to the ordinance that they do this animated 3D depiction. I've seen them. They open up the field of facts. You are entitled to those facts. You work hard. You stayed here late. You did a lot of work. You're entitled to more than just cosmetic changes, to fenestration, to taking out the logo of the front of the theater and embedding it into the facade. You are entitled to protect your community, and we ask you to do so. I thank you for the opportunity. I'm sorry that I feel so strongly about the fact that it appears that members of this commission who were excellent participators showed no bias. And if I had been given this question in advance, I would have presented you with numerous proofs as to why these people would not need to disqualify themselves. And in fact, there are some where the courts have said this isn't bias to express an opinion or to ask questions during the course of a hearing. That's all that Mr. Kellogg did, and he did it very intelligently. But someone, the applicant, perceived that he was not in favor of demolition. So they prevailed upon him to disqualify himself. I think that is one of the most unfortunate political influences on a local commission that can take place.
Thank you, Ms. Donato.
Thank you very much. I thank you for your time.
Mr. Wolfson?
Good evening. First, from my client and myself, thanks to you all for the extraordinary amount of time and attention you've put into this process. We truly appreciate it. Since Ms. Donato has expressed her concern relative to the recusal by Mr. Kellogg, not the disqualification of Mr. Kellogg, I will confirm that I contacted the commission attorney to express concern that both Commissioner Rhodes and the spouse of Mr. Kellogg had signed the petition. In addition to that, I laid out an argument as to why we believed a pattern of bias existed from Mr. Kellogg. So just for the record, and in light of her concern over that issue, I wanted to put that out there. The uses that are proposed in this development are permitted under the Borough Code. And a developer of affordable units, of which there will be 4 in this building, is entitled to a bonus as to density and massing in exchange for the provision of affordable units. In my submission to the Commission of June 3, I laid out a lot of legal stuff. I'm not going to repeat all that. I trust that you read it and you have excellent counsel who can advise you on the law. We respectfully request a certificate of historic review for the demolition of the existing building and a certificate of historic review for construction of the new building, the building that is the subject of a pending application before the Planning Board. As to the concern expressed by Ms. Donato relative to the jurisdiction of this commission to consider variances, height and massing is within your jurisdiction. However, since there is a variance for height before the Planning Board, their ultimate determination will be binding and will, because that then brings it outside the scope of review for Historic Preservation Commission. On the demolition, throughout the hearings on this application, you heard testimony and read in the reports that the building is structurally compromised and not code compliant. That reconstruction of the foundation and roof supports would be necessary to make the building code compliant, whether used as a theater or other use, and that it is not economically feasible to transform the existing buildings into a new theater or another use. In my letter, I provided quotes from the applicant's structural engineers, as well as the Commission's own structural engineer, noting in the case of your engineer that the foundation and steel framing are in poor condition, concluded that virtually all structural components that make up the structure in its current condition would require extensive rebuilding, reinforcement, or replacement. Save Madison Theater, Inc. presented testimony from a witness with acknowledged no experience in the structural design, renovation, or rehabilitation of commercial or multi-family residential buildings. In fact, the witness was a bridge engineer whose only experience in structural renovation came in connection with the renovation of his home in Cape May. The objector's witness made only conclusory comments and was not able to counter any of the sound conclusions and evidence put on the record by the applicants and the Commission's structural engineering experts. The objector did not submit an expert report. You also heard uncontroverted testimony that the existing building is not a key contributing building to the Madison Civic Commercial Historic District, and that the building has lost its architectural and historical integrity due to substantial renovations over the decades. This Commission's historic architect, John Hatch, noted in his report, quote, "The Lions Madison Theater is not one of the architecturally significant structures in the Madison Commercial District. In its current state, it is not architecturally or historically significant." Mr. Hatch also notes that the building is located in a, quote, "obscure location," quote, "on a side street at the edge of the historic district." In response to requests from commissioners and the commission's consultants, the applicant has agreed to preserve the stone plaque identifying the building and the original ticket booth and install permanent interpretive material in the new building that will include historic photos and a summary of the building's history. On the new construction, under the Borough Code, when the Commission is reviewing an application for new construction, it has two possible roles: to provide a recommendation to the Planning Board on the proposal and to act on our request for a certificate of historic review. In reviewing new construction, the Borough Code and the Madison Civic Commercial Design Guidelines, those should be a reference for the Commission. The applicant has paid particular attention to the design guidelines and the architecture within the historic district when designing and redesigning this new building. After receiving comments from the commissioners, the Commission's professionals, and the public, the applicant has made substantial revisions to its design on 4 occasions. In my letter of June 3, I include multiple instances of compliance with the guidelines. I won't read those all here now. Although Save Madison Theater presented historic preservation testimony from a second witness, the witness was not a licensed architect. Apart from making conclusory statements, the witness contributed little, if any, commentary on the new building. No report was submitted in connection with the testimony. Mr. Hatch, the Commission's own historic preservation expert and a licensed architect, confirmed in his letter dated April 29, 2019, that the applicant had, in fact, quote, made a number of changes, end quote, to bring the new building, quote, more into keeping with the overall character of the Madison Commercial Historic District, end quote. Since that letter, the applicant made additional changes, further adopting Mr. Hatch's last round of comments, which Mr. Gertler detailed in his testimony on May 6th. I'd just like to briefly address a couple of the points made in the theater's submission of June 3. In its submission letter, there are several inaccurate or disingenuous comments which attempt to address the lack of substance in the record and its desire to save the building. The objector's summation letter attacks this commission's structural engineer. The summation states that, quote, Mr. McManus is not an engineer, end quote. First, Mr. McManus is a design engineer, so the assertion is false and misleading. Additionally, the expert report submitted was prepared by John Deng, a professional engineer with McManus Design Group, and was overseen by Mr. McManus. That's in the March 12th testimony. It is also ironic that the objector finds it difficult to, quote, finds it difficult to accept the testimony of Mr. McManus, who lacks expertise in structural engineering, end quote, when the expert proffered by the objector has no experience in the engineering of commercial or multifamily buildings. The summation also places emphasis on Mr. Colleen's statement that the existing building, quote, does not need any of the additional support structure as mentioned in the McManus report, end quote. In his actual testimony on page 59 of the May 28 transcript, Mr. Colleen qualifies this statement, stating that the structural support is not needed, quote, to make the steel beam safe, end quote. There are other elements of the structure of the building that clearly need rebuilding or replacement. The summation also places emphasis on Mr. Colleen's statement that buildings should be reviewed for code compliance based on the code in place at the time of construction, decades ago. This assertion, however, ignores that any rehabilitation or renovation of the building would require the building to be code compliant with today's codes. The summation states that, quote, the only reason why the theater is not being retained is due to the applicant's desire to construct a highly intense structure to accommodate both retail and residential uses contrary to the specific limitations of the CBD1 zone, end quote. Again, the uses are permitted in that zone. There are several reasons why the existing building is not being retained, most notably because the building is structurally compromised and it is not economically viable to bring the building into compliance. As to the comments regarding the highly intense structure, there is sentiment expressed to and from the council in the past that a higher zoning might be appropriate for this area. Extensive testimony is found in the record of the close relationship of the new building to the existing building, the surrounding buildings, and the downtown district as a whole. The objector's submission letter repeatedly references Borough Code Section 112.781, which states that, quote, every reasonable effort shall be made to provide a compatible use for a property which requires minimum alteration of the building structure or site and its environment, or to use a property for its originally intended purpose. A very important clause in there is requires minimum alteration. The record is clear that that is not the case with this building. Also, the applicant has made reasonable efforts to continue the movie theater use on the property. After purchasing the property, Bowtie Cinemas continued as a tenant to operate out of the building until 2017, when they, on their own initiative, ceased to operate the movie theater on the property, even with a reduced rent. Second, the applicant's proposal includes using a portion of the new building for a theater. As shown on, as shown on the historic photographs of the property, including the one shown on the objector's website, the first floor street side of the property was originally used and intended for retail, which is how the applicant plans to use the first floor of the new building. Finally, as was discussed in the testimony, the property has been owned for 2 years by Saxum, and there's been no concrete offer made by the theater group, the borough, or any other potential purchaser. I'd like to respond briefly to the objector's suggested conditions. They propose a waiting period on demolition to force the marketing of the building, including to its group. First, to note, the building was marketed for sale prior to Saxon's purchase for almost a year, in which period no serious offers were brought forward to maintain the theater use. Second, a property owner has, as you heard here from Mr. Hatch, an absolute right to demolish a structure in the historic district, provided it meets administrative health and safety requirements applicable to any demolition. With this proposed condition, Save Madison Theater seeks to have the Historic Preservation Commission misuse a statutory scheme that cannot be used in this case for a number of reasons. Without strict adherence to the statutory requirements, imposition of such a condition is illegal. NJSA 4055D44 provides that for demolition of historic sites, an Historic Preservation Commission may recommend to the Planning Board that a site be, quote, preserved for 1 year from the making of an application for demolition. Such a reservation must be made pursuant to a borough ordinance. No borough ordinance exists. Thus, the statutory scheme cannot be used. This is because historic sites fall within the definition of public areas under that statute. Under the reservation statute, the municipality must enter into a contract to purchase the property within the 1 year or the reservation expires. The borough has been clear that it has no interest in purchasing the property. Without the borough's participation, again, this process cannot be used and the condition cannot be used. This option does not apply to properties located in historic districts that have not been designated as historic sites in and of themselves. Pursuant to the National Register nomination form, the Lions Theater is not designated as a historic site. It is also not listed on the borough's list of historic properties. The Lions Theater is only a property located within a historic district. The reservation powers, such as the conditions suggested by the theater group, apply only to designated historic sites and does not apply to properties merely located within historic districts. They also seek a condition that in the event a reasonable sale cannot be accomplished, that demolition not be permitted to occur until the applicant has obtained a firm commitment to build on the site with full funding in place. The applicant objects to that proposed condition. The applicant has put tremendous expense and time into fully engineering the application that has sat before the planning board while this commission has diligently pursued this process. As soon as we're through with this process, we will be to the planning board and we will diligently pursue that. Clients, investors are interested in moving forward with the development. We request your approval of the certificates of historic review under your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Roofson. All right.
At this point in time, I think it's our opportunity.
It's time. Yes, we've listened to lots of people over lots of months, and I think it's time for the commission to speak.
You've taken a quite lengthy opportunity to speak before the applicant on multiple occasions today. It's the opportunity. You've taken quite the opportunity to speak today to clear the record. If you wish to do so later on, you can do so before the planning board. But at this point in time, the commission has to deliberate.
Right, but the issues that I wanted to address had to do solely with what this commission will be addressing, not the planning board, Mr. Testa. You know, take me to...
You've spoken at length. I'm sorry, Mr. Donato. You can bring that up with the planning board. Thank you.
They're not bringing up to the planning board because they're not planning board issues. One of them has to do with demolition. This commission has exclusive jurisdiction over demolition.
Okay, I think we all understand that. Thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Foster. Mr. Donato, we are well aware of what the ordinances and the law provides as to demolition. There's no possibility that you could further add any more than you have already in your summations, written summations, your cross-examination of all the experts, your direct examination of your witnesses. You've done a very good job for your client.
And you're quite... I will say 3 minutes, and I'm going to put the timer. There's 3 minutes built in here, and then please, that's it. That's it. Start.
I want to just comment about the Thornton Thomasini report. This is the applicant's report, and he was good enough to separate out in Section 4 the structural work that was required to continue using the building, and he refers to certain things that aren't major. He details them all. They're not an alteration. Mr. Wilson is misinterpreting what is set forth in 112.7a, which says that use it for a compatible use, which requires minimal alteration of the building. He's mixing up alteration and repairs and what needs to be done to use it. Secondly, Mr. McManus is not an engineer. He has no designation after his name, and an engineer did not testify. Mr. Gang did not testify. So it was just Mr. McManus. Secondly, with respect to offers, there was no offer made. There was no offer made. They purchased the building, they let it deteriorate, and just because both high theater left doesn't mean that that's a reasonable effort. Mr. Wilson tries to equate the request that we had to try to see that this commission would at least give some opportunity directly to the theater group to make an offer. And he refers to it in the reservation provisions. It is error to even refer to it. A reservation is something in connection with the master plan where the municipal agency is going to reserve a road or a park or a recreation. It has nothing to do with this particular application. And it's unfortunate, but there is a mistaken reference to that. I have nothing else, but I thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. Clear. Clear? Stop. Okay. Hope that doesn't go off. All right. I think every commission member has been thinking about this and listening very hard for many, many months. We have thought about this and used the written statements that were presented to us by the applicant and by the Save Madison Theater attorney to help us craft some notes. We would like to make statements of position. We will go in order. I have the imaginary gavel, so I get to go first, and we will follow with John Solu, Carmine Toto, Mary Ellen Lenahan, and Dave Luber. Following our personal comments, we will deliberate together. I will say we have been very rigorous about not talking to each other. I don't know what my fellow commissioners will say. We were instructed very early on this, we debate in public, so we will put our positions out there and we will debate in public, and we would appreciate your listening to us as we have listened to you. So, the Madison Historic Preservation Commission is charged with the care and preservation of the entire Madison Civic and Historic Commercial District, amongst other districts and sites in the borough. A historic district, as you know, is a grouping of buildings that reflect a period of significance. In other words, the physical artifact of the building helps reveal the history of the community in a particular time. Taken together, individual buildings may be quite humble, but the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and their grouping is what is most eloquent about the community's history. The Lions Madison Theater is a contributing building in the district. It is a significant part of the historic district and represents the rise of the movie theater through the mid-20th century. But it also now reflects the change from large theater to individual digital consumption of much entertainment in its abandoned form. So I stress, the Historic Preservation Commission's responsibility to the district includes encouraging vitality of the entire district. Allowing this vacant and deteriorating building to remain creates a drag on all the district. I believe that the movie theater is not in good structural condition. 3 different reports have convinced me that it is far from easily salvageable. Adaptive reuse of buildings is a recognized way of extending their use and their life, but this is not a building that is easily adaptable to anything other than its purpose-built use. The proposal in front of us calls for demolition of the theater. Our ordinance acknowledges that buildings may be demolished despite a denial from the HPC. Our ordinance does not require a waiting period to seek alternative uses. As a practical matter, therefore, and in light of the reports of the HPC's consultants and the applicant's structural engineer, I must vote to approve demolition of the theater, mitigating that harsh reality by adding several mandatory conditions to the demolition. To that end, I suggest these conditions. 1, there should be no demolition of the building until all permits and building plans are approved, including any reviews required by the Borough of Madison, the State of New Jersey DEP, or the federal government for the impact of demolition or construction on the post office, its adjacent neighbor. The very worst thing for this district would be demolition of the existing building without replacement or with something like a surface parking lot or an empty space. I would also request documentation of the building in its physical and cultural aspects prior to demolition, as per the Secretary of Interior's standards for architectural documentation. When demolishing the building, use best practices spelled out in the National Park Service's Tech Notes, document number 3, to prevent damage to adjacent historic buildings, especially the post office and train station. Incorporating consultation with property owners of all adjacent properties within 200 feet seems to be standard procedure. And creation of permanent interpretive material to be installed in a publicly accessible space on or within the building. This decision, on my part, should not be seen as an authorization by the Historic Preservation Commission for demolition of other buildings within the district. The unique circumstances of this building type do not extend to other sites. I also call upon the Borough Construction Department to enforce more vigorously the kind of building inspections, fire inspections, and so on that are called for, so that this slow-motion demolition in place we've seen with this building is not permitted to happen at other sites. The proposal before us for the new building, which has been designed with the idea of creating more residential units downtown and providing pedestrian access to mass transit and shops. In the course of this lengthy review, the building has undergone design revisions to make its exterior surface reasonably appropriate to walk that fine line specified in the Secretary of Interior's standards, which guide this commission in their design decisions, between a clearly new building and one that gives a nod to the historic area in which it finds itself. I support the idea of a new construction within the historic district that meets this ideal. But the proposed new building is too bulky and massive for this site, and its relationship to the adjacent federal post office is troublesome. I cannot make a recommendation to the planning board that endorses a height variance for this building to 4 stories, not because I dislike height in the abstract, but because under these circumstances, the proposed new building's height and width, that is, its overall scale and mass as presented, is visually and aesthetically disruptive and puts visual pressure on the entire eastern side of the historic district. There are likely other options for the applicant to consider to address these concerns, but these options were never presented by the applicant to the Commission. Unfortunately, an option of how the building would be designed and detailed to fit within current zoning requirements was never presented. Requests to make changes in that direction were resisted by the design team. Furthermore, if the planning board does not grant a variance for the new building to exceed 3 stories, it is my recommendation that the three-story building should not be a monolithic block, but have a step back from a two-story facade similar to the existing massing. This would require modification of the surface design that has been presented to the HPC throughout this process. I can approve a new building with conditions concerning the brick color, the window size, the canopy design, the entry location, and other surface details as presented through the testimony of this meeting up to, I believe, May 6th, but could not approve a new building that exceeds the zoning requirements for the downtown. That is my statement, and next, Mr. Solu.
Thank you. Just wanted to state that next year I'll be celebrating my 50th class reunion from Madison High School. And I am an engineer, and I'm a member of the Morris County's Historic Preservation Trust Fund for the past decade. I have been a member of Madison Historic Preservation Commission for the past 19 years. I was appointed to the commission in accordance with the Madison's Historic Preservation Ordinance 31-93 as an owner of a commercial property and designee from the historic downtown district. Throughout my tenure on the commission, I have served in many capacities. For a decade, as its chairperson, I guided the commission through numerous applications, of which 3 involved decisions concerning demolition. I have attended all meetings regarding the current applications for the Lions Theater, 14 Lincoln Place in Madison. I have reviewed the submissions from expert witnesses, including the structural engineering report, May 4th, 2018, from Persimmon Engineering by David M. Bush, P.E., Thornton Tomasetti Structural Review, February 8th, 2019, Wayne A. Hostler, P.E., McManus Builders, John McManus, Engineer, Mr. Killian, P.E., and I am in agreement with the findings that the condition of the building is unsafe and it is not suitable for adaptive reuse. Therefore, I vote to allow the demolition and proceed with the conditions presented from our commission. And these would be to keep in consideration, as Janet, you explained, the mass scale and size for the district, and also would request require the development of a movie theater with documented search for an operator, bow tie, AMC, or whatever, and adherence to the latest facade proposed by Gertler and Venti Architects, LLP. Thank you.
Carmen.
I come from a family construction business that has been in existence for over 85 years. Over 60 of those years, my business has primarily been dedicated to working on historical buildings and mansions. To say that I am familiar with the construction of old buildings and mansions with clay terracotta block construction reconstruction would be an understatement. In my experience, I found buildings of the similar age as the Lions Theater, having foundations walls made of terracotta block are weak and take extensive labor, time, and expense to correct. I have 3 examples. I did the 1905 Donald Fairburn Estate, 28,000 square foot castle in Morris Township. I've been employed by this customer since 1960 up to the present day. I have had structural engineers come out and assess the situation where this type of construction has developed many cracks as well as bulging areas in the walls. This took extensive labor and time to correct the damaging walls. Another mansion in West Orange, which was over 30,000 square feet, same type of clay terracotta block construction and same similar circumstances that I mentioned previously. There's a mansion in Bedminster, New Jersey, 25,000 square feet with the same clay terracotta block construction. I found this was the same circumstances that I again previously mentioned. I have had work experience in this type of construction, and the point is it's extremely labor-intensive and time to repair walls that are constructed with this clay terracotta block. The above reasons and those reasons outlined in HBC's consultant in the interest of safety to the public and the continued preservation of the federal post office building, which is a key historic structure located next to this building, is why I favor demolition of this building. It is also my opinion that we want to continue to have a social and cultural impact on the community of Madison. It's most important that we have a movie theater on the first floor of this building. Thank you for listening to my opinion.
Thank you very much, sir. Mary Ellen.
Hello, everyone. I've been in attendance for each of the meetings of the applicant. I was also present at the theater when the applicant and commission's structural experts and the commission's preservation expert examined the exterior and interior of the movie theater. I've listened to the testimony of all the consultants and the experts, and I've read all the reports. As to demolition, the HPC's ordinances and the Secretary of Interior standards guide this commission and make it clear that any demolition in any district is really a last resort. The goal is preservation, not demolition. The commission's expert, John Hatch, stated, "The demolition of a contributing or significant structure is typically the most dramatic and most damaging action that can be contemplated in any historic district. By definition, it will have a negative impact on the character of the district." I believe it is particularly important here, as the Madison Lions Movie Theater has been a social, civic, and cultural touchpoint in Madison for most of its 90 years. However, as Janet said, the Commission has to be concerned not only with the specific property, but also with the continued vitality of the district as a whole. Even though demolition is a last resort, there are circumstances when it may be the best alternative, such as when a property, such as this one, has been unoccupied for several years and has not been maintained for an even longer period. It has become a detriment to the entire district, or it is not economically feasible to restore or rehabilitate the building or adapt the building to another use. Given the testimony of all the experts, I'm confident that the demolition of the property is necessary in light of the circumstances expressed in the expert reports of Mr. McManus and Mr. Hatch. Under the circumstances, I would reluctantly approve the demolition with mandatory conditions. I'll go into those mandatory conditions as I see them. I agree with my fellow commissioners that demolition should only be permitted with mandatory conditions in place for the applicant to abide by. The ones that I think are most important are: make sure the demolition and subsequent construction meet any federal, state, and local laws regarding demolition and construction. This is especially important as the adjacent property, the post office, is a federal building and a key contributor to our district. Permanently preserve the proposed 91-seat theater. This would provide the Madison community with a social venue and serve as a reminder of the theater. Applicant has proposed keeping the theater as long as, quote, a commercially acceptable tenant may be found. Otherwise, applicant has indicated it wants to use the theater as retail space. I do believe that a permanent theater there is very important. My third point is to protect, permanently preserve, reuse, and incorporate into the building's design several artifacts from the existing building, such as the stone plaque in the central facade, which identifies the building, the ticket booth, and photos and history of the theater. In additionally, permanently document the exterior and interior of the property via video and photographs. Further, as to the proposed new construction at this property, I believe the applicant has not shown that the new construction will meet with and not detract from the district aesthetically. The guidelines provide that new construction within the district shall not be discouraged when such alterations, additions, or new buildings do not destroy significant historical, architectural, or cultural material, and such design is compatible with the size, scale, color, material, and character of the property, streetscape, and environment. These guidelines also provided that the design of any new structure in the historic district is important because it must be compatible with the existing structures and must harmonize the visual characteristics of the streetscape. The applicant has worked diligently and, after several iterations, provided revisions to the proposed building as respects color, window, parapets, spandrels, front door, canopies. These modifications are fine. However, the scale, height, and mass of the building, as proposed, is just too big. I do not believe that the applicant has shown the proposed design of the new structure is in harmony with the visual characteristics of the streetscape and existing structures in the building. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Luber.
I have had the pleasure of serving on this commission for about 5 years, and it has many important functions. But above all else, we are tasked with protecting and promoting the historical and social heritage of this community so that it can be passed on from generation to generation. When I was first appointed to this commission, it was not only because of my knowledge of the history of this community, but also my interest in the cultural and social history of this community. Since then, my passion has only grown. The many key and contributing buildings within the Civic Commercial District embody the evolution of this community's cultural and social heritage. I believe that the continued preservation of not only the historical structures in the district, but the continued vitality of the Civic Commercial District as a whole is perhaps one of the most important responsibilities that both I and the other members of the Commission have. Make no mistake, in making my decision on this particular application, I have not rushed to judgment. I have considered the materials presented by the applicant, the Commission's consultants, and the objector. I have reviewed the reports and testimony submitted by the experts and the consultants, and I have listened intently to the statements from the public. With the exception of the engineer for Save the Madison Theater, all of the structural engineering consultants in their reports and oral presentations observed that, and I use Mr. Hatch's words, the building is significantly deteriorated and has some significant structural issues. The HPC's consultant structural engineer, John McManus, observed that virtually all structural components that make up the structure in its current condition would require extensive rebuilding, reinforcing, or replacement, and that the issues with the exterior walls would have to be addressed by introducing remedial structural system such as a network of steel columns and beams to replace or supplement the structural capacity of the current structure. During his oral testimony on March 12th, Mr. McManus stated that all the options for repair would be costly, but you can repair certain things. When I asked Mr. McManus his conclusions as to the amount of work that would be required to bring the building up to acceptability, he explained that the building would require a lot of repairs, and that virtually every component of the building is either under design or damaged enough where it would require extensive work or replacement. The applicant's structural expert, Robert Cornfield, stated in his report that the level of work required is unlikely to be economically sustainable in any scenario, including restoration of its functions as a movie theater. Mr. Hatch concluded that restoration would be expensive but not impossible, and Mr. McManus explained that the building had significantly deteriorated. I agree with Mr. Hatch that demolition would be the most drastic and damaging action for a building in the historic district. But I have to say that it is certainly not desirable to have that building sit unoccupied in its current state for another 2 or 5 or 10 years. I think it is even less desirable for the continued vitality of this property, the key buildings adjacent to this property, and the district as a whole. So based on all the criteria set forth in the district's demolition ordinances, I believe demolition is appropriate, as I feel it has been shown the structural soundness and integrity of the building are major concerns for the district as a whole and the adjacent property, the federal post office building, that could be adversely affected if the Lions Theater continued to fall into disrepair. However, I must emphasize that just because I think demolition is appropriate in this exceptional situation only, that does not mean that demolition and redesign of this property will go unregulated. As I said in the beginning, I believe the continued preservation of not only the historical structures of the district, but the continued vitality of the civic commercial district as a whole is one of the most important responsibilities I have. The following mandatory conditions for demolition I recommend. Demolition is not to proceed until final decisions have been made on all land use applications for variance type and other relief. All federal, state, and local government permits and approvals have been applied for and obtained, and the applicant is otherwise shown to be in full compliance with all other federal, state, and local laws. In preparing for, carrying out, and completing demolition and reconstruction of the building and all structures existing and/or to exist at the property, the applicant is to comply with the standards of the Federal Secretary of the Interior for demolition and construction of properties located adjacent to historical buildings, and shall apply for and obtain all federal and state approvals and forward same to the Commission before any demolition work is to commence. Demolition shall not proceed until the applicant obtains written consent from all adjacent property owners as to the measures to be taken to protect the surrounding properties from damage during the demolition and reconstruction phases of the project. Demolition shall not proceed until the applicant has completed documentation of the existing building and its historical significance through detailed measured drawings, photographs, and video recordings. Preserving and reuse of the stone plaque in the central gable and the ticket booth. Installing a permanent interpretive materials in the front lobby of the new building that includes historic photos and a summary of the building's history. include a usable boutique movie theater in the replacement building designed for reasonable use by commercial, educational, or nonprofit operators from time to time so the property continues to be utilized as a place for artisans and students. Given the amount of public interest in this application, I feel that these conditions are absolutely reasonable and necessary and would further promote business, create positions, attract visitors, students, historians, and artists to the district, and educate citizens on our community's history, cultural development, and heritage. In his reports, Mr. Hatch repeatedly observed that the proposed design of the new building raises two overall issues: its scale and mass and its architectural detailing. With respect to architectural detailing, Mr. Hatch wrote that the proposed building appeared to be too tough and industrial for the Madison Commercial District, and he listed a number of reasons why. One particular reason is that part of what makes and I'm quoting, part of what makes this building feel industrial is the relative proportion of openings to solid wall. I have personally surveyed many of the existing buildings in the district in order to get a personal feel for the proportions of these buildings to the proposed buildings. Based on this, I agreed with this observation. After the initial proposal, the applicant did make a number of changes to the design that the HPC's expert, Mr. Hatch, observed, and I quote, help mitigate the industrial feel of the design and bring it in more keeping with the overall character of the district. I agree with this conclusion, and I'm satisfied with the most current updated architectural details, in particular for the first 3 floors of the current position. However, with respect to scale and mass, the proposed building has 4 floors and is higher than any other building on the block, and consequently, its overall volume in mass is greater than any other building on Lincoln Place. It is my opinion that the new building that is above 3 stories in height would be incompatible with and detract from the ambiance of the district and the key structures of the district that are directly adjacent to the property. A building limited to 3 stories would be more in line with the makeup of the district. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Luber. I think you can all hear we've thought very long and hard about this and have a long list now of suggestions and conditions. I would like to start by making an official motion for us to vote to approve a certificate of historic review for demolition of the Madison Lions Theater building and to add conditions. So I guess we say yay or nay to, the vote is to approve the demolition. I think I heard many of you say you approve, yes, but. And it's getting the but, the conditions that we are able to apply, in this case under our ordinance, in order that the mandatory conditions are all things that we agree to. So let me do it in reverse order. You had a nice list, Mr. Luber. What is your vote on certificate of historic review to approve a demolition of the Madison Lions Theater building?
I approve.
Okay. And your conditions were, as you just said, no demolition until all permits are in place. If I can try to summarize this, all permits and requirements are in place. Documentation of the building in its physical and cultural aspects according to standards for that. Using best practices in the demolition itself to avoid damage of neighboring buildings. And you said an interesting thing, no demolition without written consent from the neighbors. I think that's interesting and an interesting addition to this. Creation of permanent interpretive materials on the site. And what else did I?
Reuse of the plaque.
Reuse of the, so that I would put when we get to talking about the new building.
Okay.
Just my thing, the demolition first. Yes, okay, and we may add to this list as we go through.
Okay.
Mr. Toto, what is your vote on a motion to approve a certificate of historic review for demolition of the Lions Theater building?
Approve it.
Okay, and conditions that you would have in addition to those we've already mentioned. I think you said making sure there was a theater there?
Yes.
Yes, which the applicant has offered in their plans, so you would like to see that codified if possible, okay?
That was included in my list.
Yes. Okay, thank you. That's
Mr. Luber, your conditions, were they mandatory conditions?
Yes.
Or were they recommendations? They're mandatory conditions?
Yes.
I just want to make sure that's clear in the record. So the conditions that you have proposed
Yes.
are mandatory conditions? Okay. And I'm sorry, Mr. Toto, I apologize for jumping around. I think you had included the boutique theater that Mr. Luber referenced as a mandatory condition as to demolition? Yes. Okay.
thank you, yes. In addition what, sir?
Were there any other additions that you wanted to add to the conditions that Mr. Luber had suggested already?
Myself, no. Everything.
Okay. Mr. Solu, how do you vote on approval of an application, certificate of historic review for demolition of the Madison Lions Theater?
I approve of the application to demolish, and as I mentioned earlier, mass and scale and size should be considered.
Okay,
This part of it.
so maybe when we get to the new building, because we're just talking about the demolition right now, and so you've heard some of the conditions, the mandatory conditions. Would you change any of that? Do you have any additional material? We're talking about interpretive materials, demolition best practices, documentation of the building, no demolition until all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed in terms of permitting, and I think we'll talk about the plaques and the other things with the new building, and the theater, preservation of a theater use, yes? Which is sort of part of a new building, but sustaining a use of the existing building. Anything else?
No other
Okay,
requirements.
so we have yes. Ms. Lenahan?
Yes. I approve demolition of the theater, and I agree with all the recommendations that have made prior to this, and those recommendations are mandatory.
Okay. And I, too, reluctantly agree that, yes, demolition is the appropriate solution here in order to apply mandatory conditions to this demolition, which we can do under our ordinance, and that would make this happen in an orderly way and preserve as much as we can of the history of the building.
So at this point in time, we've heard a list of the mandatory conditions that were discussed. There is really, and the record isn't clear on this, I think you have to make a motion formally to approve the certificate of historic review for demolition with mandatory conditions. That's based on what's been discussed.
Okay, that's why I have you with me. Thank you.
Excuse me, Madam Chair. May
Yes,
I just
sir.
be heard briefly? We're obviously just digesting the conditions as you lay them out. There were two things, though, that immediately we felt the need to comment on. The permanent preservation of the proposed theater, it will not be feasible depending on what happens at the planning board and otherwise in terms of the economics of the project. So for that reason, we would ask that the condition be that which we propose, that we provide evidence of our marketing of the theater.
There is, and I just want to make sure then, because when I read the transcript back from the initial hearing, Mr. Rinaldi did provide his presentation before the board, and he said that the proposal before the board was for a 91 or 100-foot or 100-seat theater at that point in time.
It is, as one of the...
In my understanding, that's been the continuing representation of the applicant throughout.
But as one of the commissioners noted, the proposal specifically on the record is that he will make a good faith effort to market that if he can obtain a commercially feasible user for it based upon his experience with the difficulty of finding theater operators downtown. So one of the commissioners acknowledged that in their remarks just now.
Does that have to be a commercial theater, or can it be a nonprofit theater that brings its funding from outside sources to running the theater?
My understanding is an economic consideration, and knowing my client as I do, he would probably be more pleased if there was an economically feasible nonprofit.
We understand that, and we appreciate the comment. You're making an objection to that? Is that what you're saying? To that
Yes.
condition? Okay, you have it on the record, but
Respectful. And
one other hasn't even actually been provided yet. We just discussed it.
Just trying to be efficient.
Man, I appreciate that.
And the other feedback is we have no problem complying with the Secretary's standards on demolition. We understand the need to protect the post office, comply with all other requirements, but to get consent of all property owners to the demolition may not be feasible. It's unusual, and it's an administrative action to...
I understand that. So in the ordinance, it does talk about the notice that's supposed to be provided within 200 feet, and then there's the notice that's supposed to be posted on the building within 10 days of the demolition. With respect to the historic buildings specifically, you will, as I probably provided to you already too, the tech notes from the U.S. Department of Secretary Interior do provide a collaborative effort in consultation with the adjacent property owner.
Which we understand and we agree to, but to ultimately be subject to the consent of any one particular adjacent property owner could be an issue.
Have you reached out to the Federal Post Office Postmaster or the General Service Administration yet?
We've just been trying to get through this process.
I did see them for the other property owners. I didn't see anything for the Federal Post Office, however.
We haven't talked to the post office.
No.
My experience in dealing with the post office is it's not an easy task, but we've been focused on...
It takes time. It's the federal government. We understand.
We've been focused on you guys.
Yeah.
So those are our two initial comments on what...
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Certainly, the intent here is to protect. There's been a lot of talk about the value of key buildings or significant buildings or contributing buildings. We, I think, are all groping to try to be extra careful to an immediate adjacent building that is key. Doesn't make it necessarily better. It's just has a different designation within the district. So your concerns are duly noted, Mr. Wolfson, and we will endeavor to create a path forward for all of us on this. So, my counsel says we voted to approve demolition and we outlined some conditions, but we have to make it a formal
motion to approve demolition, a certificate of historical review as a demolition with mandatory conditions.
Okay.
And you want to list those mandatory conditions, obviously, which we've discussed at length here. And obviously, this will be formalized in a resolution.
Put it in writing. All right. So, motion is to approve a certificate of historic review for demolition of the Madison Theater with mandatory conditions. The conditions being no demolition until permits and building plans are approved, required documentation of the building, best practices in demolition, permanent interpretive material installed in a publicly accessible space on or within the building, marketing, use, preservation of a theater, use inside the building as per the applicant's plan, and that may be all for the demolition part. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? No. Hearing no objection, then that motion is carried, and we will, of course, in our resolution be much more specific with our council's help about the exact wording of those mandatory conditions.
Okay. Now we wanted to move on to the mandatory conditions for the design and construction of the building. As you know, in the discussion we've approved the design per se, but we are still concerned with the mass and scale and volume. But in addition to that, we have some mandatory conditions, some of which overlap with the ones we spoke about previously. So,
I think at this point in time it'd be appropriate to make a motion to approve a certificate of historic review as to redesign with exceptions or deny with exceptions, because my understanding is from the collective here, and correct me if I'm wrong, from characterizing this wrong, you all are very concerned with the mass and scale and volume of this building. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay. And basically, to summarize, it would be that because it's over 3 stories is one of the big concerns, and it's not compatible with the visual characteristics and the streetscape
Yes.
of the district. Is that correct?
Yes.
okay.
So as to the application for certificate of historic review as to the redesign, a motion should be made as to your position as to the redesign and whether or not you recommend it as submitted to in the form that it's provided right now. If you're okay with the actual makeup and material, color, and facade, that's one aspect of it. But if you're concerned with the mass, scale, height, and volume of the building and being incompatible with the district, there should be a recommendation that's made to the planning board against that issue.
Okay,
That's my suggestion.
that's a good suggestion. I'm just trying to think how to do that. Thank you for helping us.
So there should be a motion as to a certificate, an issuance of certificate of a historic review,
Right.
as to the redesign and construction of the new building.
All right. I make a motion that we accept the design, the proposed new design for the building proposed to replace the Madison Lions Theater with mandatory. No, I'm sorry. This is not conditioned.
Mass,
right.
Scale.
Sorry.
Well, that's right. Mass, scale, and volume.
Volume.
Right.
Is what your concern is, right?
Yes.
So
I think
are you
that's
okay
all.
with
Yes.
The windows. Are you okay with the facade?
How do we
Color-
separate this out?
Yes.
So would you recommend the current design of the building with the exception that, or but for
Its size,
the height of the building, mass, scale, and volume?
height and number of stories.
Pardon?
Height and number of stories.
Okay, I'm looking for help here to craft a very inclusive. I hear us all kind of on the same place, and so I appreciate your help in making this a motion that we can do. As you know, our deliberations are generally much more collaborative than this, so this is new territory.
So we're supposed to propose that we be able to issue a certificate of historic review as to the design of the building as presented, with the exception of the mass, scale, and volume of the building.
Yes.
Especially as respects the 4 stories and that's it, primarily the 4 stories.
I'll second that so we can discuss it.
Okay.
Yes. That sounded like a motion to me, Mary Ellen.
Okay, yes.
Is that good enough for you?
That's motion?
Okay.
Motion?
Okay, seconded. Yes, so we can discuss that a little bit more. Yeah, I think the work that has been done in presenting and refining the elevations has gotten the building to a pretty good place. As I said in my opening remarks, it straddles that line between being clearly new and yet part of the community that it finds itself in. We do not want to make a new building on that site match the height of its neighbors because it happens to be wedged between 2 one-story buildings, and I think that would be completely inappropriate next to the towering train station. But we also find it difficult to endorse a height and a size of this that exceeds the zoning requirements of the CBD. And so the elevations, the the smaller windows, all the things that were agreed and recorded as of April 5th and the May 6th meeting, which include the red brick with the lighter colored upper story, the recession of the window plane with sort of pilasters to give more definition to the facade, storefronts on Lincoln Place, storefronts that open directly to Lincoln Place, reuse of the cast stone Lions Theater plaque, which the applicant has said they would do, and replacing that appropriately within the new building. Reuse, possible reconstruction. We understand condition is an issue of the ticket booth as a feature somehow in the new building. An interpretive plaque that's on the building. There was some discussion about using the space on the west side of the building that is shared visually with the post office as being a more welcoming public space than it is currently. I'm thinking those are all things that I see my fellow colleagues nodding, that those are in a sense mandatory conditions that reinforce the design that we have already seen.
Yes. Are you also permanently documenting the exterior and interior of the building?
Well, that went with the demolition.
Okay.
So one does not preclude the other,
okay.
But thank you for reminding me of that. And
the alignment of the front retail entrance in the center.
Yes, they redid that.
Right, which again is codified right now in the plans. What is a little unclear is if we object to the bulk of the building, to the height and the bulk, if this gets washed through the planning board somehow, does it come out the same way, or are we going to... it's hard to condition one thing if we don't know what the outcome is at the end. I'm having a little trouble with that, actually.
So I think the motion can be made now to approve the redesign and reconstruction of the building, with the exception that mass, scale, and height are not recommended.
And in particular...
Recommend against mass, scale, and height at this point in time.
Do you say, and in particular, a fourth floor?
Yes. So that would be the motion. That's my understanding, based on all the conditions you discussed.
Okay.
And as to this aspect, we have a mechanism, both under the ordinances of the municipal land use law, to have representative of the commission to be made available to the planning board during their hearings to provide additional testimony as a consulting expert to the board on behalf of the commission. So if that needs to be clarified at that point in time, we can do it then as well, in addition to our resolution.
Okay. So let's try that again. Make a motion to approve, to grant a certificate of historic review that confirms or approves the revised design of the exterior of the theater with with the exception of the height, the fourth, and I don't want to say just the fourth story, the height and or fourth story. There are different ways that could be dealt with. And so that answers our concern about...
So that's the motion?
bulk. Yes.
Seconded?
Second?
Okay, all in favor?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Any opposed? No. Then we pass that motion as well.
And again, this will all be embodied in a resolution.
Which will be available soon, but not tonight.
Right.
Okay.
Seeing
All
that
right.
the application has now been fully decided, I believe at this point in time we have nothing else left on the agenda.
I'm just checking the agenda, and I think we need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
So moved.
So moved.
Mr. Wolfson's coming up.
Just like to thank the commissioners again and their professionals for their patience and diligence through the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf.
Thank you.
Okay, vote with your feet. Good night.
Motion is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wait for me, I'll look you out.
Well, we have to go over